Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you very much to the Honourable Chester Burrows and to his office for hosting us here today and making this space available for us to talk to you about South Sudan. My name is Darren Brunk. I'm the humanitarian coordinator at the Council for International Development, and those who don't know us, the Council is the umbrella organization for New Zealand's international development and humanitarian NGOs. So New Zealand NGOs engaged in over 40 countries on the humanitarian side alone. So a very broad network. And we're very fortunate today to be able to have this panel of New Zealanders who can bring a really interesting New Zealand perspective to what is happening in South Sudan, and to look and talk about what role is there for New Zealand to be playing in this context, one of the worst crises, complex crises that we find in the world today. So it's going to be a chance for us really to hear some of their own personal experiences and where they see different roles for New Zealand to play in being a positive contribution to resolving the crisis. In terms of the panelists that you're going to be hearing from, beside me here we've got Simon Day, who is the Head of External Affairs with World Vision New Zealand. Simon had the opportunity to be in South Sudan earlier this year, just prior to the resurgence of conflict in July 2016, so he can talk about his experiences on the ground. Mark Mitchell, who is the Humanitarian Program Coordinator at Caritas Aotearoa, New Zealand. Mark can bring the post-conflict perspective, as it were. Mark was on the ground in Juba following the recent violence in 2016, just recently returned, and so can give us some fresh perspective of what he's seen in his experience. Aban Yor, who is the General Manager of the Auckland Refugee Community Coalition. Aban is a proud New Zealander of South Sudanese origin, and can speak from his own compelling personal experience about the situation. And of course, Karsten Bokmio, the Research and Policy Manager at Amnesty International New Zealand. Karsten also has done a lot of work with the Security Council Working Group, bringing a lot of our NGOs into contact with MFAT, talking about New Zealand's seat on the Security Council, and we'll be able to bring that broader policy perspective. And there's a lot of good reason to be talking about South Sudan. As I mentioned, just to give you a snapshot of the type of crisis that we're dealing with, some of the compelling numbers. We're talking about 2.3 million people who've been displaced in South Sudan, 4.8 million people who are experiencing food insecurity, including 250,000 children who are severely malnourished, and 50,000 deaths since the resurgence of violence in 2013 alone. And New Zealand is there. New Zealand has a big role to play in this context. Our New Zealand Defence Forces have been supporting the UN mission in South Sudan since 2011, since the start of the mission. Our own network of SID NGOs doing humanitarian work have received from the New Zealand public $7 million over the last 2 years, making it one of the larger countries where the New Zealand public has wanted to support humanitarian activity. So it matters to our New Zealand public. And of course, New Zealand is sitting on the Security Council. And even for the limited time that we have left, South Sudan is going to be very much on the agenda, and some important steps and some important decisions that need to be taken where New Zealand can really show some positive leadership in bringing out the right types of changes. So just to give you kind of the 30,000 foot view of this crisis, my first experience with working with South Sudan came in 1999 when I was working in Egypt with the refugee community in Egypt, many of whom came from South Sudan, and they would get out from the train line. They went from Khartoum to Cairo, and so there's a big population there. Of course, at the time, it was a very different conflict that a lot of people from South Sudan were fleeing. At the time, the Sudanese People Liberation Movement, an army, the South Sudanese political force, was at war with the government of a single Sudanese state, the government in Khartoum. And that was a conflict that between the 80s when it began and its resolution in the mid-noughts claimed about 1.5 million lives, a significant conflict. So fast forward to 2013, and what we're to understand kind of what we're seeing and what we're experiencing today. South Sudan is now its own state, having had its referendum in 2011. It has an elected president in Salva Kiir, a Dinka, and of course that's the SPLM that's in power and also in parts in opposition. But it's hard to see that South Sudan is much more of a unified state than even the singular Sudan was that came before it. And we see this, in 2013 with a lot of divisions that are coming to the fore within the government. Salva Kiir in 2013, fearing a coup plot, dismisses his cabinet and also dismisses one of his main political rivals and his vice president, Riek Machar, who's also a Nuer. And this split leads to a new civil war in the new country of South Sudan. We get a peace agreement in 2015 that lasts for just about a year, bringing us to July 2016, while Riek Machar and Salva Kiir are having discussions in the presidential palace, their factions start fighting in the streets, both have sizable military forces in the capital. That conflict escalates, and it leads to the latest round of conflict. In the last couple of months, then, we see that hundreds have died. There have been attacks not only on local South Sudanese, but also on aid workers, which we'll be talking about. Many cases of sexual violence, of rape, and gang rape. 36,000 people who are seeking shelter in the UN compound, as well as in NGO compounds. And at least 100,000 who flee the country, just since July, to give you a sense of the extent of the conflict that we're looking at. Which brings us to today, and the pieces that our panel is going to be talking about. A country that is under a very, very tenuous peace, that is facing massive humanitarian needs, this ongoing humanitarian crisis. A UN mission that's in need of outside support and professional capacity, and a political process that is also severely in need of outside help in a lot of different ways to push the peace process forward. So that's the context. I'm going to turn it over to our panel to deliver their own views and experiences, and then we'll open it up for a chance to ask some questions. And we'll maybe start with Simon.
Thank you all for being here. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to you about South Sudan. Now that Darren is giving you that 30,000-foot view, I wanted to take the opportunity to speak about the people I met and the things they'd witnessed, and also the hope that I saw in South Sudan, because it is such an intensely desperate situation that you can forget that does exist in places like this. I also wanted to briefly acknowledge the bravery and admiration I have for my colleagues who are based there. They're working in very difficult circumstances, and unfortunately one of our colleagues was killed last week. In Western Equatoria, he had a gunman come into his home and kill him, his wife, his nephew, and his son. So it's really difficult circumstances where we're working, but we have to acknowledge the things that we face there, and this desire and bravery that people have to continue to go to these places to try and create better outcomes for people who do deserve it. So I was in South Sudan at the end of May and the beginning of June. I travelled with Michael Morra from News Hub ahead of the 5th anniversary to try and raise New Zealanders' awareness of this place. It is, in so many ways, a forgotten crisis. So we travelled from Juba to Malakal in the Upper Nile, former Upper Nile state, and then along the northern banks of the Nile from Welshuluk to the village of Kadok. And almost everywhere we went, there was an anxiety that violence was on the edge of eruption. And in fact, a month after that I was there, we saw what happened in July around the 5th anniversary. And just months before I'd been there, in the Malakal protection of civilians site that had been raided by troops from the city, This is a place where people would come onto a UN base to seek protection, and even there they were unsafe. Half of the camp was burnt down, 20 people were killed, and for over 48 hours there was this lawlessness that raged through that camp. But I met people who had seen, especially children who had seen things that they never should. A young boy talked to me about watching a pregnant woman have her child cut from her and then her murdered as well. And that it was just really shocking to hear this, but at the same time, especially the children, were just so brave. The Malakau Protection of Civilian Site, for example, has a 40,000 person population, and 60% of those are children. They've witnessed, like I said, some really horrific things. But they're the future of South Sudan, and that is where often I saw hope despite what they'd been through. A young girl had seen some of her father's friends burned in the city, was just so happy now to be able to be back at school. She was studying at a World Vision child-friendly space, which is, it was working as half school, half psychosocial centre, where there was an opportunity just for children to be children again, to have fun. She was leading her school in song and dance when we visited, and she talked to us about how desperate she was for this place to be kept open. Half of it had been burnt down during the recent fighting, and she didn't know what would happen to her without this opportunity to study and to feel safe in this place. I met a 12-year-old boy named John who was desperate to be a national football representative, and he knew where New Zealand was, the bottom of the world, he said. And he had no toys, he had one set of clothes, yet he was happy because he was at school, and he believed that he was the future of this country. He was maybe young and naive, but he truly believed that there was an opportunity for him and his compatriots to change what was going on for them in this world. He told me that he desperately wanted to keep going to school so he could grow, so that South Sudan could grow. But unfortunately, nearly 1 in 3 schools in South Sudan has been destroyed or damaged or is now being occupied by military actors. More than 900,000 children have had their education affected, and 350,000 of those aren't going to school at all anymore. And without that education, there's little choice when people keep coming to take your cattle or keep coming to attack your family for you to pick up arms. But everyone I spoke to wanted peace. They wanted New Zealanders to care about South Sudan, because without us remembering what's happening there will never be peace without the intervention of the international community. So when we went across the Nile into the small town of Wal-Shuluk that is now 50% populated by people who have been displaced by the conflict, we met Emmanuel. He was just 6 months old, and he'd been abandoned when he was 3 months old. His mother was unable to provide for him because of the desperate economic situation. But he'd been rescued initially by World Vision and then adopted by a local. And he had gone from being acutely malnourished to being a chubby, healthy young boy now. And he had hope, and there was hope for Emmanuel to be bigger than the situation, be better than the situation that he had found himself in initially, because people were willing to give him a chance and intervene in his life. From Wal-Shuluk, we travelled 60 kilometres along the Nile. That actually took us 5 hours. The roads are really badly damaged every rainy season, and they become almost completely impassable during that wet season. And now it's almost impossible to reach the village of Kadok that we visited because the road is impassable, and the security situation means you can no longer use the river for transport. And this isolation prevents an idea of a South Sudanese identity. It's really hard to create a sense of willing to be a part of something bigger when you have no phone reception, when you have no way to reach the village just 50 kilometres down the road. So it's every day is a battle for survival. But when I visited that village, the difference New Zealand money had been able to make, there were projects that had been funded by money provided to World Vision from New Zealanders, was really incredible. Just the year before, there'd been an intense cholera outbreak, and that had led to the death of a number of young children. In that time, we had provided water and sanitation facilities that allowed the village to take water from the Nile and filter that and provide, through just one of these facilities, clean drinking water for more than 5,000 people. So the difference that can be made very quickly, it was immediately apparent to me everywhere that we went. The difference we were making in the lives of children and the ability for them to believe that they could make a difference in their own country and that they could build a functional, a beautiful city, out of a beautiful country out of South Sudan, was really powerful to see. But the window is small. You know, there is a country here wrapped in fear and tension because of the violence they've seen for so long. We met children who, after school, they're making guns and RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, out of mud because for all their lives they've seen as violence. So there is this opportunity to break that cycle with this generation of young people who are eager to be more than their circumstances has allowed them so far. And I think New Zealand has a really powerful opportunity to play a role in that, but we need to do it as soon as we can, because there's only so long that you can survive in a place like this before you are left with few options, but to flee or to take up weapons to defend your own life. So I'd urge New Zealanders who are already doing amazing things to contribute, to continue thinking about South Sudan, and beyond that, continue to believe that we can make a difference in these people's lives who are desperate to be more than has been allowed of them at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. I'd like to talk now about the humanitarian response on the ground following the most recent outbreak. I was there just a month ago in support of Caritas South Sudan. Caritas is one of several New Zealand, as has been mentioned, one of several New Zealand organisations who are responding in South Sudan. Other members include World Vision, obviously, CWS, UNICEF, Oxfam, and Save the Children. And as Darren said earlier, over $7 million has been raised by the public over the last 2 years. This is a significant amount of money that we are investing from New Zealand, and it's fantastic to see the commitment that is coming from the public. As I mentioned, I work with Caritas. Now, Caritas is the second largest humanitarian organisation in the world. We are the agency, the Catholic Aid and Development Agency, and so we work very closely with churches and dioceses around the world, and this includes in South Sudan, where we do work through the various dioceses across the whole country. And I was there to support Caritas South Sudan, which, as it happens, is our newest member. It is a local organisation, locally run. All of the staff are local, but they requested for some additional assistance, and so I got the straw, I guess. And so I was there to provide support to them as they were developing an appropriate response to this most recent outbreak of violence. And so we were there trying to provide very practical needs. And we are providing practical needs along with our colleagues. And of course, the most immediate needs are for food. People are displaced, they have no access to their food. They need water and sanitation. And as Simon alluded to, there are outbreaks of cholera. Fortunately, because of good intervention by my colleagues, there is a reduction in the amount of cholera now. It was, I think, at its peak around 700 people had been affected. There are also needs for shelter and emergency household supplies. There are medical needs which are being addressed by various different organisations. And this is, of course, for the treatment of illness and traumatic incidents following the violence. But there are some challenges in providing medical care. Obviously, people are displaced. Those with chronic illness are not able as easily to be able to receive that ongoing assistance that they require. And again, as Simon mentioned, there is some great challenge in getting to those who have been affected, getting to places to carry out the assessments, to find out what is needed, and also to get to provide the assistance that is required. And it is due to ongoing violence. We heard, and you'll have seen in the reports, of warehouses that have been ransacked, of trucks that are hijacked en route to support displaced people. And, of course, the weather doesn't help either. The infrastructure is very poor, and I heard of one particular incident where a truck had been stuck in the road, mud up to its axles for 6 months, not able to get through because of the very heavy rain. But there is one thing that works very, very well, and that is the coordination amongst NGOs. There are over 120 organisations, and I'm sure that there are actually very many more than that, but 120 organisations who are working together, coordinating under the UN-based sector clusters to ensure that the response is coordinated, to ensure that gaps are reduced, and to ensure that duplication is minimised. And this is working very well, and it was great to encourage Caritas South Sudan to attend these cluster meetings, to get engaged with the other organisations as well. But there are other needs. There are needs that are less tangible. What is coming through, and I'm sure it will continue to flow through this discussion today, is the violence that nearly everybody has encountered and experienced personally. And how do you work through that? How do you work through this psychological damage that so many have received? Stories abound of personal violent attacks against women, against children, and against men. And as a father of two daughters myself, it is terrifying and horrifying to hear some of those stories. We've heard some of them today already. But it is upon this foundation that we must continue to build, and the people of South Sudan, I should say, should continue to build civil structure, civil society. We also have heard the attacks while I was there, not while I was there, but I heard of it while I was there, of the attacks at the Terrain Hotel. Many of you will have heard of this, and the gang rape of foreign aid workers, and the murder of a local journalist on the 11th of July. It's a horrendous situation, and my heart bleeds for those people. And some of the reports that continue to come through, and the courageousness and the strength of character that they are demonstrating is unbelievable. But in spite of this violence, we must continue to work in places like South Sudan, and we must continue to respond to the very human need. Because, of course, the brutality that I talk about is happening on a daily basis. Since, or in the month of July, during the outbreak of violence, there were 217 reported cases of sexual violence. Now, I know, and I'm sure that we know, that is just the very tip of the iceberg. And so the other part that, as aid organisations, the UN, the NGOs must be involved in is assisting in ensuring a position of protection to those who have been displaced by the violence. Everybody that I spoke to said that they want to go home. They long to go home. They long for a normal life. And some have gone home, but they have been forced back to displacement camps because of the violence. They have got to their home only to find it being burnt to the ground. All of their household effects have been stolen, destroyed. You know, what they want to do is to be able to go out. Now is the time for harvest. Now is the time for replanting. But they're not able to do so because of the ongoing violence. And so, of course, that means that in the next season we are going to be facing food insecurity. And this shortage is driving up food prices. South Sudan has the highest rate of inflation in the world at 661%, the current rates. As humanitarian organisations, we are compelled to support. We are supporting. New Zealand-based organisations are going out and are providing support and working alongside their local counterparts. But we can only provide limited support. Programmes are underfunded. The UN and NGO Joint Humanitarian Response Plan is for 2016 seeking $1.3 billion to support the best part of half of the country, 5.1 million people. But at this stage, only 40% has been pledged. As the attacks at the Terrain Hotel demonstrate, aid workers are coming under increased attack in South Sudan and in other conflict situations. We can no longer assume safety under the humanitarian banner, but that does not mean that we should shy away from providing support. We must, and I implore you, we must respond to situations such as this, in spite of concerns about health and safety. We need to put in place measures to manage that insecurity, but we must continue to respond. And although New Zealand has a very appropriate and natural focus on the Pacific, we can and must do more in responding to the needs around the world in countries such as South Sudan, where the population is facing ongoing conflict. And I'd like to suggest that channeling funds through New Zealand-based organisations, such as those represented here, is a very tangible, a very efficient and a very effective way of doing just that. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, everyone. Warm greeting to you all. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge Council for International Development for inviting me being here. My name is Aban Yor. That is a short name for Kiwi name, but original name is Aban Kemia Jagyor. I originally South Sudanese born, and I born in the Upper Nile State, Malakal. I was displaced as a young child, age of 13, to Sudan, and I've been there for 14 years. And I was a refugee in Syria, Damascus, for 5 years. And I've been in New Zealand for 11 years, working alongside with the communities from refugees background, 17 different countries. Why am I just sharing this? Because the opportunity which I get from New Zealand, that is the positivity about New Zealand, I need to pay it back. For me being here as a South Sudanese, New Zealand, I think I have what it takes to join myself and the rest of New Zealanders who have had to support what is going on in Southern Sudan. I want to share the life of being displaced person. Being displaced, always there is a hardship. And through that hardship is access and education, especially for children, findings, health care, healthy food, and also employment opportunity. That's the basic need for any human being might need. That's where you become a displaced person. And when I was in Sudan, it was not just easy. Because of that, I didn't find the safety or refuge which I was seeking for from Southern Sudan to Sudan. I left Sudan and I came to Syria. What's in Syria itself is another challenge. It's not the Syria everyone's seeing now, but it used to be in peace. I was there for 5 years seeking for protection to be a refugee. I've been there in prison for 3 months and 10 days because I asked my right to be protected as just a normal person. I came to New Zealand and I re-educate myself to see that what I can contribute as a person. So there is some kind of the thing that I would like to really share with you, being in a position of displaced person or being a refugee. The country of asylum itself might be a challenge for the displaced person or the refugees themselves. There is a lot of human abuses there. And mainly, always, women and children become the highest vulnerable population. The men can be in a prison or can be anywhere. But the women and the children always, they've been caught up as a higher victim in that. And what I witnessed through my journey as an individual or person who have a family today, what I saw, what I experienced being in New Zealand 11 years, that gave me not just a hope, give me a positive mind at that. I always say in the public, I'm New Zealand born, Southern Sudanese born, but a New Zealand product. Because what I saw in New Zealand, I never get it anywhere else in the world. So I took that opportunity to try to find a way how I can make a difference, which is many people, they never make that difference in my life. But I took that opportunity to make a difference in other people's lives. What is going on in Southern Sudan is not about peacekeeping. It's about peacemaking. And New Zealand capable really to influence in that. When I say New Zealand capable to influence in that, we already recognize internationally as a tiny island, we are really very active when we come to a humanitarian aspect. So what I'm saying here, there are two things immediate New Zealand can do. Firstly, New Zealand can have opportunity to resettle people from refugee background who are already make New Zealand their home, to be given opportunity to be united with their families who are already in the refugees camp. There is a refugees camp in Egypt, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Syria, in Lebanon, and other neighbors countries. And especially the higher need for those who have been displaced who are settled in Sudan. There's a lot of abuses going on there. Every single day you hear a lot of stories. Women and children, because those who've been displaced in Sudan there, those husband has been killed in the war, what is going on in Southern Sudan. So New Zealand have opportunity to play a big role by saying, those already make New Zealand their country, okay, do you have any relative in all those refugees camp? And then combine that within our system so those people can unite with their families. Because at the moment, I will tell you, for those who are in New Zealand here, you will find just isolated members, just person by himself, no extended family. So New Zealand can do that immediately. Secondly, New Zealand can respond regarding what happened in Syria, the same things. We should have a special cases where New Zealand can say, okay, I can do this for South Sudanese people and I can bring them to New Zealand. Why I'm saying this, I experienced this. New Zealand has capacity to really to do this. Lately, in February, we have a public hearing, which is increasing the quota program, has been launched by Amnesty International. All the entire New Zealand, they agree that the refugees quota should be increased. So this is the area where the New Zealand immediate can be respond to that. Thirdly, New Zealand can respond in terms of family link and family unification, working alongside with UNHCR. This is where the immediate link can come. And the most important part of it might be hard for us, but we can play a role on it as well to influence in terms of the politics part of it. The root cause of Southern Sudan is the lack of leadership. And New Zealand, in terms of leadership, we are good at it. Even myself, I'm part of that. The capacity of education of the leaders of Southern Sudan, New Zealand can provide it. And that is the root cause of the problem. Accountability, injustice, security. Those kind of the element of the country, New Zealand can influence by collaborating with other players within the region. What is going on in Southern Sudan is not just Southern Sudanese leaders themselves, but there is external pressure on them as well, keeping doing that. And who is the victim? The civilian. And what is going on in the world today, people are talking about the politics, they make peace here, but they never look in the side of the humanitarian part. So I would admire New Zealand government to work alongside with such of credible NGOs who are working in grassroots in Southern Sudan there to make sure we can make a difference as already we made for other nations. And thank you.
Thanks, and I'll try to keep it very short so we can have a bit of space for discussion. I'd actually like to start by clarifying that I'm probably the only person on this panel who has never been to South Sudan. My involvement mainly stems from advocacy and campaigning work with Amnesty International, both at the UN in New York throughout 2014 and since 2015 here in Wellington. So my perspective is obviously a bit different. We've already heard quite a bit about the horrors that civilians go through in the country, so I won't go into detail on that other than to say or to reiterate that actually both parties to the conflict deliberately target civilians. And it's an absolutely atrocious conflict, and despite the relative calm that we're seeing right now in South Sudan, there's always a great risk of mass atrocities reoccurring. Let's keep that in mind in terms of context. What I would like to very briefly touch on is what actually enables this disgusting violence that we see on a near daily basis in South Sudan, and that's mainly two things. It's arms and it's widespread impunity for crimes under international law. On the first thing, arms. The country, South Sudan, is awash with heavy military equipment, small arms, light weapons. Amnesty International has been documenting how war crimes have been committed. The majority of the killing has been done using small arms and light weapons, such as pistols, machine guns. But then we've also documented how heavy stuff like mortars, shells, helicopters, tanks are being used to deliberately kill civilians, to deliberately destroy, loot villages and towns, to deliberately commit sexual violence and other atrocious acts. So how do these arms end up in the hands of mass murderers? It's actually pretty straightforward. Direct shipments by countries including China, Uganda, Israel, Ukraine, and a couple of others. For instance, in 2014, and I was working in New York back then, and I still remember a very uncomfortable meeting at the permanent mission to the UN of China's embassy to New York. In 2014, in June, Amnesty International uncovered how the Chinese state-owned defense manufacturer, Norinco, provided more than 1,000 tons of small arms and light weapons worth around $40 million to the government of South Sudan in the middle of an atrocious conflict.